If you think authenticity is being able to satisfy your some desire that you have, or maybe you've relished the thought of burping, or you've held yourself back somehow, and authenticity seems to be being able to do that. Well, maybe that's a process, but maybe you need to listen a little bit further here to what I'm going to talk about today. This is Marx Headroom. 5-day fast, breaking it here in just a few minutes, and sharing some of the insights from a week of walking around in a very conformed metropolitan world, interacting with people on social media, with all the content I've put out, books, and just bringing some of that out right here, almost like I'm living like a monk in some ways, and not conforming to some of the things people think you need to live. And yet here I am, 5 years of doing this 5-day fasting and refeeding on the weekends. So authenticity. I heard someone talking the other day, and this is a very popular author who's written a bunch of books. He grew up as a very privileged person in New York, and I think he really means well. I think he's made a lot of money, and from his books, as well as doing a lot of coaching and advisory work. But I heard him talking about being authentic, and talked about being able to burp and do anything you wanted, anywhere you wanted. So I think maybe he'd been inhibited in his life, and those things were things that, honestly, he was wishing he had the chance to do, and he defines that as authenticity. Well, that's not authenticity in my book, but in all respect to his process and everyone else's, authenticity is what you define it as. And I don't think there's one true definition for it. But let me talk about what that means to me, and you can make up your own choice as to what that word means in your life. But authenticity means, to me, it's a process, and it's one of those things that is not necessarily defined by any conformed standard. And by definition, it's something that you define for yourself as to whether that is real and necessary, and is expressing your values and who you are. And it might be different at one stage in your life than it is in another. And I think everyone goes through a process of developing their relationship with with others and themselves. And in that process, you let go of some things that maybe you're holding yourself back, and allowing yourself to try new things and experiment, rather than just following some conformed path. And I think those conformed paths, where we just have accepted, and we're acting, and our behavior is really just designed in some conformed or pre-designed role, that you never really have a chance to find what you really want, and what might be available to you in your life. So being authentic is a process, in the way I would define it. And ultimately, if you've spent some time and invested your energy and focus and your heart and mind into observing and working with how things operate and unfold in your life, then you have a chance to be authentic, and to be honest and sincere. And it may be that you want to be that way in certain circumstances, and there's in other circumstances and relationships that you're in that you don't share that part of yourself, and that's your choice. But I also had someone in the movie business the other day talk about how ask me why I thought there were people, going on camera, especially on social media and being, like in their pajamas and looking all roughed up and everything. And I think, well, there is a real wave of effort being put into presenting things in an curated fashion for others to see, and that's in some people's minds that's called authentic, and it's more like just the window dressing or the clothes and the surface and superficial things are unkept, and they're not as nice and neat as they might have been. But you can still be inauthentic behind all that and acting out on things that are not really true to your nature. And, but that's up to each person, I think, to work out for themselves. So that's just a few thoughts on authenticity. And, I had I shared a dream last week, and it was kind of a deep dream about power and organizational acceptance and how you conduct yourself around power and authority and conformed systems and institutions. And this week I had an interesting dream I'll just mention briefly, but it was more about intimacy. And I'm not talking about, anything that's super private to me, but it was just a real insight into intimacy, and that was a one-on-one connection with another person and how you really look and hear and see and relate almost like at a psychic um, level, seeing beyond the things that most of the time we just don't take time to recognize in the people around us. And when you do encounter someone and you do have the privilege to really look deeper and take the time to engage and to go back and forth, there's an art form to that. And I want to say one of the biggest benefits that I've encountered in the last 10 years was the chance to study Meisner, the Meisner acting craft, which is a deep, almost spiritual, psychological uh, practice that is taught in by some teachers that have studied that method, and they provide kind of a classroom setting where it's safe to work with those techniques of repeating and making observations and having them either confirmed or disaffirmed by someone that you're um, in this process of developing your your senses in connecting with another person. So I'll just say that about intimacy, and if you're interested in knowing more about Meisner, I'd love to open up more discussions about that because I think it really does create the chance to open up all of your feelings, and it really does work towards this elevated level of self awareness and understanding about yourself and the world and people around you, which it seems to be more and more about what a lot of my interest and deeper interest continue to evolve in communicating how that might be possible for us. So I think that's about all I have to say right now. Tough week in another tough week in the civil unrest here in the United States and much of the world. I've been writing some articles on violence and dominance and um, doing some work on transcendent around artificial intelligence and the call of the wild. And I've got another one to produce here shortly about um, the old man in the sea, um, in kind of in conjunction with finding meaning through the strife and the obstacles that we encounter in our life, and how that may make it worth living. Um, all the stuff in the news about these ICE people, ICE agents, and police officers, and I can't help but mention my father was in law enforcement as well as having a. He was also he was a uh, he did some ministering through the Church of Christ, and he also had multiple psychology degrees as well as criminology. And he studied all that whenever I was basically an infant and up to, I think, maybe 5 or 6 years of age, that he ended up getting several advanced degrees in that area and ultimately practiced some forensic hypnosis. And I think he was kind of a forerunner in the 1970s of some of the human development and really optimizing using your visualization and trying to find your optimum potential as a human being. So I thank him for that. Um, but a funny story about choosing to be in law enforcement, and I think a lot of people have this assumption that if you're an officer or if you're in law enforcement that you had a masculinity issue or some you wanted to dominate others, and that was so far from what my father had, how he ended up, becoming an officer initially. But I think he was a very troubled kid. He was the third born, and he ended up fighting a lot in the 40s when he was growing up and had a hard time. And he dropped out of high school to become a Marine, and he gave that a lot of credit for, that discipline and that structure, giving him um, really, I think agency is a new word that's being used for this, but really helping him really have a he had, kind of a wild and free spirit that wasn't really fitting into any conformed um, role in society, and was really struggling. Even after he got out of the Marine Corps, he had encountered, that um, structure and rigor and discipline and willpower, and really that really fit him well. But he had some family issues back on the farm back in Missouri where his mother and father needed him, and his father ended up passing shortly after that, and he really was struggling. And a friend of his had him drive probably 120, 150 miles into Springfield, Missouri, into the Ozarks, because his friend wanted to apply for a position at the police department. And my dad, being a good friend, drove him in, and his friend talked him into applying, alongside him for a role in the being a police officer. And I think reluctantly, my father went ahead and applied. Well, they both ended up getting a job, and the friend quit 6 months later, and my father ended up um, staying for 30 years and running the police department here in Springfield, as well as raising a family and being a part of the community, and got a lot of meaning out of that in his life. But it really wore him out, and so I'll leave it at that. But yeah, I think as he looked back on that, and I wanted to follow in his footsteps, and he wouldn't even consider allowing me to do that. That was one thing that was just X'd off. But I think when I approached him to do something similar, it was more around, being involved in community, and it wasn't necessarily being an enforcer of the law, because I really saw him more as a leader of people, and he led with his heart and was known. I think the eulogy that was given by one of his fellow officers was that he was an example of how um, nice guys could still end up doing okay in life. So he was never about the gun or the control or the dominance, but he did have respect for the law, and always seemed to find himself on the kind of in the middle of the cusp of that, between the affluent and the less affluent in the area around Springfield. Lots of interesting stories, and he was kind of pulled in and out of having um, really power, and being plugged into all the information that was flowing through the police department, kind of plugged in and unplugged at various points of times, due to various political and circumstances that were unfolding in the area, kind of behind the scenes, so to speak. So I think those of you that are true crime lovers, or know that there's a lot of unsolved mysteries around Springfield. So if these walls could talk, well, I've got a few cassettes that, if anybody's interested, you might find quite fascinating, that he left me, of some recordings of some interviews that he had conducted, and for some reason had kind of slipped away in an old cigar box that I discovered after he passed. So we'll leave it at that. I hope you all are doing great. Leave me some comments if you feel like it, and I'll go break my fast now. Wish you all the best.